Well, hello fellow fly fishers and future fellow fly fishers. Welcome back to my 10-part series on fly fishing for beginners. And in part 3 we're going to talk about some different fly fishing techniques that you can use to catch fish. So the first one I want to talk about is dry fly fishing. So when you're dry fly fishing, you're going to use a fly that floats on the surface of the water that will imitate a natural insect or look close to it. So, and that insect is either going to come up from the bottom of the river to hatch and fly away, or it's going to land on the surface of the water to lay its eggs, or it's going to fall into the water in the case of a terrestrial, like a grasshopper, a cricket, an ant, maybe a beetle. So fly fishing is also probably the most visual form of fly fishing, where you're going to actually see the fish come up and take your fly. So that's where a lot of people are going to get hooked, excuse the pun, but you're going to get hooked on fly fishing when you see a big fish come and take your fly for the first time. So it's very exciting. So when you are fly fishing, and dry fly fishing especially, you're going to want this to drift along the surface with the speed of the current, drag-free drift. So we're going to talk about that more when we go out and fish in part 8. But there's a few ways to achieve that as a beginner, and one is I'm going to encourage you to fish upstream as much as possible that you can, and 2, to keep a short cast. So you want to keep as much fly line off the water as possible to prevent the current from dragging the line around and then moving this fly around unnaturally on the surface of the water. So in a nutshell, that's dry fly fishing. Now, this is the beauty of this sport is, if you want to just dry fly fish, there's plenty of people that just dry fly fish, and you can deep dive into the insects and learn their Latin names and all the different species. There's I think there's like 3,000 different species of mayflies. On the west coast where I am, I think there's 500. So not all are important to the trout's diet, but mayflies, caddisflies, stoneflies, midges, those are all very important. You can deep dive into that if you want. And as a matter of fact, some people consider dry fly fishing the epitome of fly fishing, and that's all they do. So that's dry fly fishing in a nutshell. We'll come back and let me just show you the next technique. Before we move on, let's just summarize the key points. Okay, the next technique I'd like to talk to you guys about is called dry dropper fishing. You'll also hear that referred to as hopper dropper, because it's very common to fish a nymph down here below a grasshopper during grasshopper season, where that happens to be where you live. It's a very effective way to fish. So in dry dropper fishing, you're fishing like you are with a dry fly, but the dry fly is going to be, you want something very buoyant and visible, because it's going to be almost like a strike indicator. It serves 2 purposes. 1, a fish may take your dry fly, or 2, when a fish takes your nymph, this is going to hesitate, move sideways to the current, get pulled under the water. So it's an indicator and a fly. So a little bit about this. You want to set your nymph down about 12 to 24 inches below your dry fly. The longer this gets, a little more difficult it is to cast. I would say the sweet spot is 18 inches for, if you're just beginning. That's pretty good. You can cover multiple depths of water. You're going to use clinch knots everywhere, of course. Even when you're dry fly fishing here, you're going to have a clinch knot or a Davy knot. Here you'll be tying a clinch knot, and then you can use a clinch knot or a Davy knot down in your nymph. Remember the Davy knot, we'll talk about that in part 6. It's a very small knot tie too. So you're going to still do the same thing. You're going to try to strive for a drag-free drift, and you've got the opportunity to catch 2 fish. So like I said, any big buoyant fly, you can use Elk-hair caddis, something called a humpy. There's different types of humpies. A grasshopper is a favorite, a stimulator. Some of these names you're probably not familiar with, but or a larger parachute fly. Okay, and then the size of this fly up here will be dependent on the weight of this nymph you're fishing in, and a little bit to do with the current or the surface disturbance of the water. If you're fishing in a little choppier water, you want a little heavier or larger, more buoyant fly. If you're fishing in a very still, slow-moving water that's very clear, you might want to use a little smaller fly and a little smaller nymph, depending. Anyway, that's it for this. Remember, try to start with about 18 inches right here. Okay, let's move on to our next technique. Before we move on, let's just summarize the key points. Okay, I just want to briefly touch on a type of fly fishing or technique. It's called wet fly fishing. And that's probably the oldest form or technique of modern fly fishing that there is. So way back 15, 16, 1700s, when they didn't have floating lines, 1800s as a matter of fact, in the early 1900s, floating lines and synthetic material and maybe some floatants that you can put on your fly to float. Most people used to fish with what they call the wet flies. And it was a popular technique, although it has waned. You don't see many people do it now, but I like to do it. I think it's a lot of fun, and I think it's good for a beginner. And I'm going to tell you why. One, you're going to feel the strikes most likely. Two, it's easy to cast. When this line gets down here below you, your line's going to be under tension, and we're going to learn about casting in part 7. So you don't want to have any slack. So if you're fishing upstream, you're going to have slack. You're going to have to figure out, I'm going to talk about how to figure that out to get rid of the slack before you cast. Okay, so it's a little easier to cast, and then you can cover a lot of water with this technique. So in a nutshell, what you'll do is you'll cast out across the current at about 30 to 45 degrees downstream, and then you will allow your fly to just swing across the current. This is called the swing. So you could catch a fish anywhere on this swing. You could catch a fish as soon as this hits the water, but you allow it to swing cross current. You'll follow it down with your rod, so that goes down too. And what happens is this is sinking as it's swinging across the current. When it's directly down below you, now it's down here, and you're over here, it's directly below you. It's going to start to rise in the water column. It's going to look like a natural insect coming from the bottom of the stream or river. And that's a lot of strikes happen in this area right here. That's in a nutshell how you do it, and the reason you can cover a lot of water is because you're going to swing it across, cast 3 or 4 times, no fish. You're just going to take a couple steps, cast. You know, and as you learn to read the water, you'll know where to do this more effectively. Now, and some people may argue that no natural insect swings across the current like this. So some people like to fish this upstream. So very similar to a dry fly, but you're fishing a wet fly. So wet fly, if I didn't say, it's a subsurface method, just like nymph fishing or indicator fishing or dry dropper, where you're fishing in below the surface. This is a subsurface method of fishing or technique. Oh, and there's a couple flies I'll recommend in part 5, wet flies, that I particularly like. I don't think I need to say much more about this. The nice thing is you don't need to change out your rig, your outfit. All you need to do is cut off the dry fly and tie in a wet fly. You can use the same clinch knot. In indicator fishing, what I'm going to talk about next, you have to change out your setups. Anyway, you don't have to do it here. Okay, before we move on, let's just summarize the key points. Okay, the last technique I wanted to talk to you guys about is called indicator fishing. Now, I had to do a little soul searching whether I wanted to bring this up or not, but I would be reticent of my duties if I didn't talk about it. I don't suggest that you go this way as a beginner, but when you're fishing, and as you start to fish, you're going to see people fishing with this technique. So you're going to say, what's that? I don't want you to do that. I want you to at least say, oh, I know what that is, that they're indicator fishing. When you're indicator fishing, in essence, your dry fly and a dry dropper setup is replaced with an indicator, which I'll show you a few in a second. I didn't talk about them in part 2. But you're fishing with an indicator, and then down below, you're gonna be trailing some nymphs, 1 or 2 nymphs. Most likely, most people will fish with 2. Just FYI. You'll be using, most of the time, I use a fluorocarbon tippet. I think most people that indicator fish will have fluorocarbon tippet, which is different from the nylon tippet that I showed you. It's more expensive, for one. It is more abrasion resistant. It is almost invisible to the fish, as it does not reflect the rays of light as well as nylon does. It sinks faster. It has a less of a elasticity to it. Another little thing here, if you tie fluorocarbon to nylon, you don't want to tie it directly because the fluorocarbon can cut through the nylon, so you use what's called a tippet ring, which is a very small, and I mean 1 or 2 millimeter steel ring that you'll tie your leader to, your nylon leader, and then off of that you'll tie your tippet. The knots are the same. You can use clench knots down here for your nymphs, and then there's a trick to how deep. Here's where I don't really talk about it too much because there's nuances to this, and let me just tell you one of the nuances, and probably the biggest one. But here's the surface of the water, and the current at the surface is going to be much faster than the current close to the bottom. So now you're going to be fishing close to the bottom, and the trick is you want these nymphs to travel at the same rate of speed that the current is close to the bottom of the stream. So you have to get the weights right here and the type of nymphs, and the kind of a little bit has to do with how you cast. But if you're doing it right, this will be traveling at a slower rate of speed than the surface current. It's not that easy to do. It takes some experience to get this right. But how do you know what the depth is? You're going to take a guess. You're going to look out there and say, I think I'm fishing in, I don't know, 2 feet of water. So you're going to set the length of the tippet to 3 feet. So I just want you guys to know it's out there because you're going to see people fishing this way. Okay, let me show you guys a few different styles of indicators that I have with me. I know we didn't talk about this in part 2, so here we go. I'm going to show you my favorite one first, which I buy at bait shops. They don't have fly shops, so they're a lot cheaper. That's a money-saving tip, but you know, you got to support your fly shops if you have one around you. This is called the Easy Trout Float. It's very easy to use. You insert your leader through the slit, and then you put the stopper in, and that's it. Easy to move up and down your line as you go, and the depth changes of, you know, in the water you're fishing. This is called an thingamabobber. It's not as easy to move up and down your line, but this is like a plastic, air-filled plastic material. Then there's cork. So cork is, of course, a natural material, so if you lose these, which you will, it won't take as big of a toll on the environment. Some of these thingamabobbers and this Easy Trout Float are styrofoam and plastic. They don't biodegrade. And they come in all different sizes based on the weight of the nymphs you're fishing and the condition of the water. Lots of different styles, and but if you do to go that way, I would suggest you try to find these if you can, and then maybe spray paint them white. Or I think my next favorite go-to would be the airlock. Okay, that's enough about indicators. Okay. Well, that about wraps it up for the different techniques you can use to catch fish as a beginner. Before we move on, let's summarize the key points of indicator fishing. like to thank you guys for watching this part 3, and I hope you stick around for part 4. We're going to talk about stream entomology. Okay, thanks for watching. See ya.